Many years, let me think, when was it? Bob Goodman, my good friend from school, and I.
And the boat.
We rented a house together. It was a summer cottage in Port Washington. And we rented it in the winter. It was very cheap. And we had a Model A Ford. The Ford was from the 30s, and this was in right after the war, 1946, I guess. He worked at Hazeltine on Long Island, and I worked at Airborne Instruments Laboratory in Mineola. And we had this car. What was I going to tell you about the car?
The car phone.
Oh, yes. We were driving in New York one day, and Bob had, for some reason, a telephone handset. I remember I was driving, he was sitting in the passenger seat, and we were stopped in traffic. And he, as a joke, picked up the phone and started pretending to talk, and the fellow in the car next to us, I mean, this is back before such a thing was possible. He stared. Where'd you get that? Where'd you get that? So we invented the car phone, in effect, without realizing it. The house was, I think I told you this before, it was heated, it had a kerosene stove, tank outside with a pipe that came into the stove. And as I say, it was a summer cottage, a shack. And if we ran all the burners on the stove and had a fire in the fireplace, we could avoid freezing to death.
Can we just briefly tell the story about the other car and the airplane fuel? That's the last one, I promise.
Well, back before that, my oldest car was a 1936 Plymouth, which actually belonged to Pete Lang, my brother-in-law's brother. Now, Pete had this 36 Plymouth in 42 when he got drafted. So he left the car in my care to take care of in his absence. And I drove it while I was in college. We used it, me and my buddies, to drive down to Atlantic City and stuff like that. Of course, gas was rationed, and we couldn't get much gas. But kerosene was available. You could go into a hardware store and buy kerosene. So we found that the car ran fine on kerosene. It was hard to start. So what we had to do was keep a quart bottle of gasoline, which we would pour into the carburetor to get it started, and then it ran on the kerosene. It made big clouds of white smoke as you drove down the street, but it drove. And we used it all that summer of 42. In 43, I took it up to New York and then ultimately up to Boston, to Cambridge, where I went to work at the Harvard lab. And part of my job up there was run flight tests on antennas that we were developing. And one such set of tests involved a new antenna for a B-24 airplane. And the Air Force sent a B-24 in from Wright-Patterson Air Force Base into Boston. It wasn't the Boston airport, it was something out in the suburbs. I can't remember the name of the, Bedford, I think it was. Bedford Airport. In any event, the fellows who came with a crew of 3, a lieutenant who was the pilot, a captain who was the co-pilot, and a sergeant who was the crew chief. And we flew every day. But at night they wanted to go out and carouse. So I was happy to lend them my car, but of course there was no gas. But they decided they could drain some out of the B-24. So this Plymouth, which was running on kerosene mostly, suddenly got injected with 130 octane aviation fuel And it ran great on that. It blew out one big cloud of smoke to clear out the results of the kerosene, and then it ran fine. And one of the captain was an interesting guy. His name was Stork. I can't remember his first name. But he had just come back after, well, this was 43. Doolittle's raid on Tokyo. He was one of the pilots. And when was that? That must have been probably in about January of, it was shortly after the war began, I think, wasn't it? Does anybody know? Well, in any event, he was on Doolittle's raid over Tokyo. And he hated Doolittle because he figured it was all a big publicity thing for Mr. Doolittle. Doolittle was, they flew off a very small carrier. And they were pretty good-sized planes, twin-engine bombers. And they could only get one on the flight deck at a time. So they had to get one plane off and then bring up the next one. Doolittle was off in the first plane. So he was in, over Tokyo, dropped his bombs, was going over to China, where he landed on a friendly airfield. We were allies of China at the time. And he had no problem at all. He was home a couple days. My friend Captain Stork was in the last plane, which was like an hour or so later. He said by the time he got to Tokyo, the sky was black with anti-aircraft fire, with Japanese planes. They got all shot up. They did manage to crash land in China, and fortunately were picked up by friendly troops. But he was then, had to walk out of China, walked down to the, what do they call it, flying the hump. General Chenault was famous for running a group of Air Force pilots who flew from, what's the border between China and, I guess, the Malay Peninsula? No, it wasn't the islands, it was in the mainland. Anyway, we were flying the hump. It was known as the hump in those days, the mountains. Flying over to bomb Japanese troops in Japan and in China. He was over there for another year before he finally got home. Also, he hated the Japanese because there were only one or two incidents during the war where there was actually enemy fire on the continental United States. And one of them was when a submarine came up off the coast of California and lobbed in a few shells, and they did practically no damage. The biggest damage they did was knocking the front porch off a house that belonged to Captain Stork's grandmother in near Pasadena somewhere, I think. And not Pasadena, it was up north or near San Francisco. In any event, he was an interesting guy. So that's my experience in the war.
Well, thanks, Dad.